Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this session on my favorite topic of collective leadership. I know we're competing with Al Gore and others, so I appreciate your sharing my personal passion for this. So we'll just dive in. Very close to where we are right now. This is the tallest building in the world. I'm actually now spacing on the name. Do you all know the Burj Khalifa? It's 154 stories high, and it is a representation of an incredible amount of collective leadership that it took to produce this building in 6 years. Think about all of the ministers and excellencies and city planners and developers and construction workers and engineers of all kinds, from environmental engineers to mechanical and civil engineers, to all the people who it took to come together, think together, debate, develop a shared vision, and collaborate to make this happen. The idea that accomplishing something so big would require collective leadership seems obvious, and yet our work in communities around the world to ensure that all children fulfill their potential, we take a very different approach, which in my experience looks more like this, meaning, we're playing whack-a-mole. In my experience, like, we're searching for the thing that will kind of fix the problem, and you tackle one piece of the puzzle and then something else pops up. In our experience, this isn't the key to success. This is an image from the World Bank's World Development Report on Education, which just came out this fall. And it really struck me. The words across the top are, it's more complicated than it looks. People act in reaction to the choices of others throughout the system, and it's kind of an image of all the different pieces of the puzzle who ultimately impact whether we do right by our kids. And the World Bank was making the case that in order to achieve real progress, we need a coalition of actors from all the different parts of that ecosystem, students and parents and teachers and administrators and policymakers and many others from around the whole ecosystem around children, to come together around a shared vision for children. So developing that kind of collective leadership seems like exactly what we need to do, and yet it's very challenging, and it's going to take an intentional approach to develop it. So in my experience, I think collective leadership has three parts. The first part is, we need leadership, again, around the whole ecosystem around children. So I think about this little girl who was hard at work when I recently visited her school in a village in Nepal. And if you think about all the different pieces that need to come together to ensure she fulfills her potential, it's a lot. Like, we have to consider, first of all, if she's able to come to school every day. Does she have, what kind of family responsibilities and social issues might prevent her from doing that? Does she have access to adequate nutrition and clean water? Is she met with clear and high expectations? Does she have the teachers and other supports to actually meet those expectations at the school level? Does she have the family support that she needs to pursue those expectations? So ultimately, to ensure she fulfills her potential, it's going to take so many people coming together, from her own family to the village leaders, to the teachers and others in her school. So that's the first part of collective leadership, just an understanding that this really is going to entail all of us, not only teachers and school leaders, but really all of us around that whole ecosystem working together. The second aspect of this notion of collective leadership for me is the idea that it will take a diverse coalition. It will take people who are in positions of influence and responsibility today, and at the same time, it takes the people who themselves have experienced the inequities being part of crafting the vision and in fact, ultimately leading the effort, to address the inequities. This gentleman is Charles Abour. He's one of the first fellows in Teach for Uganda's cohort. He was the 10th kid in his family growing up in a refugee camp in his country of Uganda. And he was never supposed to go to school. It's a long story, but he overcame every odd and found his way ultimately to one of the most significant universities in Uganda. It's a big 40,000 kid STEM university. He became the student body president. He had all the offers in the world, PwC, oil and gas companies, and he decided to join Teach for Uganda. So he's now in his second month of teaching in a remote village in Uganda. And his leadership, I mean, already, and I've seen the reports because I had the chance to meet him, and I've been kind of staying posted on what he's doing. And he and his fellow teacher, a woman named Carol, who's also part of this first cohort, have already recruited many students who weren't being sent to school back to school, and they've been working to instill pride among the other teachers and kids in the school community. And he's already thinking very differently than he was before about his future. He's plotting his run for the parliament because he said that his experience in the school, even just in the last 1.5 months, has just taken him back to his childhood, remembering what it's like to be hungry every day. And he feels like he just has to get into the policy-making infrastructure in order to address that problem. So you just think about how powerful it is that he has decided to channel his energy in this direction. His leadership is so fundamentally shaped by his own life experience and what he's bringing to his kids, what he will bring to the parliament because he shares the background of the students who are most impacted by this issue. He'll be able to be a very different kind of leader, and his advocacy will be, all the harder to resist. So that's the second notion. Just an aspect, I think, of collective leadership that we need, again, to build a diverse coalition, and that coalition needs to be ultimately led by the people who themselves have experienced the inequities, because to do anything other than that essentially perpetuates the divisions we have today and enables the folks in privilege to call the shots, and at the same time it leads us to have to forego the incredibly important perspective of the folks who have themselves experienced the inequities. The third aspect of collective leadership that I've come to think a lot about is this notion of space, like creating the space that enables the people around that whole ecosystem, the diverse coalition of folks around that ecosystem, to build relationships, to have the difficult discussions like the people building that building had, right? To develop shared vision, to grow the collective wisdom. This is a wonderful woman named Nadine Paul Deroli who started Teach for Haiti, Anse pour Haiti, which is Creole for Teach for Haiti. And she's here, this is from a visit I made to one of the communities in which they work, and she's here with a few of the stakeholders from this community. But before she started Anse pour Haiti, she spent 3 years building relationships within the 4 communities where they would launch and developing a shared vision for children in those communities. So by the time children are 25, what do we want to have be true? And she worked with students and with students' parents and with the most respected kind of elders in these communities in pursuit of developing that vision, which she then works backwards from. So, in planning all the aspects of her program. And I think about her example because when you walk into these communities, people literally talk about the vision they have for students. And I think it's just such an incredible example of the power of creating the space to have those reflective discussions. What I've seen in my own country of the United States is that it is possible to have a lot of folks working around a whole ecosystem around kids in a community, and even for those folks to be quite diverse, and yet for for folks to have their heads down and be working incredibly hard on all the different aspects of the ecosystem without taking the time to step up and create the space so that we ensure that all of our efforts are actually pointing in the same direction. So we have lots of tensions simmering under the surface and debates and discussions that never get had, and lots of potential lessons learned that we never surface and come together around to develop to sort of inform the future. And what I've now learned from so many people, including Nadine, all around the world, and also from studying the Peter Senge's of the world and their work to understand what is behind systemic change in other sectors beyond the educational realm, is that that there's something incredibly important and powerful, again, about creating those spaces and holding those spaces, and also something quite elusive. It's much easier said than done. So this work to develop collective leadership is really what Teach for All is all about. We're a network of independent organizations in 48 countries and growing that are all working to develop collective leadership to ensure all children fulfill their potential. It's hard, and hopefully that's clear from this whole talk. I mean, this is such a journey, but these organizations are working to do this through, first of all, working to galvanize the rising generation of leaders, a diverse group of those folks, people who have deeply experienced inequity themselves and people from the most privileged parts of their countries, to channel their energy into the arena of working with the most marginalized kids. They do this by calling upon them to commit 2 years to teach in some of the most under-resourced communities, and then investing a lot in their development, not only during the 2 years, but beyond. Those 2 years can be so important for the kids they work with, and at the same time, they're really deeply transformational for the people who sign up. So they never leave the work. All around the world, 70% of them are working full-time in education well beyond the 2 years they initially sign up, and many more are maybe moving into policy or public health or other parts of that ecosystem around children. And they work alongside others in their communities, from students to parents to veteran teachers and many others, in pursuit of ensuring all children do fulfill their potential. We came together a couple of years ago in a very inclusive kind of ground up process to ask ourselves, what are we working on over the next 25 years? What's the big vision for 25 years from now? We deeply believe that this work to ensure all children do fulfill their potential is a very long game, thus the question of let's just embrace 25 years. And this is the vision we developed, that we'll see whole communities in every part of the world enabling all of their children to have the education and support and opportunity to shape a better future for themselves and all of us, so that those communities will inspire and inform a worldwide movement to do this everywhere. This is clearly a very big and lofty vision, but so was the idea of building the tallest building in the world, and they did that in only 6 years. And I've come to think that there's a path to reaching this. We could do it, but the big, big question is whether we will be able to develop the collective leadership necessary to make it happen. So with that beginning, I'm going to welcome a couple of other people into this discussion. I'm realizing that I didn't introduce myself, which I'll do, and then I'll introduce our other two panelists, and I think we'll have enough time to just have an open discussion about all of this. I started Teach for America way back in the day, almost 30 years ago, and one of the best parts of this whole journey started about 12 years ago when I started meeting incredible people from all over the world who were determined to do something similar in their countries. And that's what led to the launch of Teach for All about 10 years ago. And I'm continuing to serve as the CEO of Teach for All. And I'm going to welcome two people. First, Tarun. who is a fellow from Teach for India. He was working at Unilever and left his role there to commit to Teach for India several years ago, and he's subsequently launched an organization called Indus Action, which, among other things, is essentially building a movement among the moms of the kids in some of the most, high poverty communities across India to advocate for and ensure that their kids access the right they have based on the laws in India to a quality education. So Tarun, go ahead and come up and and Kaya Henderson as well, who is an alum of Teach for America, who became the school's chancellor in Washington, D.C. And Kaya first was the deputy chancellor and then the school's chancellor, and she stepped into a situation where, many would say that the mayor was voted out of his position because of unrest about kind of the education reforms that had been ushered in while she was there as deputy chancellor, and she stepped up into the chancellor role and somehow managed to not only, create one of the highest, in fact, the highest performing and fastest improving, not highest performing, but fastest improving urban district in the country, but also to become one of the most popular public officials in Washington, D.C., which is a very challenging thing to do. And I'm excited for her to share her learnings and journey as well. So I'm going to ask them a couple questions, and then we'll just open it up. So Tarun, I think many would say that the parents of the kids who Teach for India is working with might not have just the, capability or motivation or something to actually advocate for their kids' education. And yet, I think you've found something very different. And I'd love for you to share your experience in that and kind of what you've learned it takes to kind of develop the leadership of your students' parents.
Thanks, Wendy, for the opportunity. Good morning, everyone. So very briefly, I'm going to share the context of the work that we do and answer your question, Wendy. So there is a law in the Right to Education Act in India, which mandates access to private unaided schools across the country for children from socially and economically disadvantaged backgrounds. This came into effect in 2009. And it affects about 2 million children, 2.2 million children every year. And to give you some context, every year about 20 million children enter the schooling system in India. And this law mandates that 10% of those seats are actually marked out from children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And this has an incidental effect on 6 million other children who share the classroom with the 2 million children. So 8 million out of 20 million are affected by this particular policy. And as I was studying it at grad school, I realized that the take-up was less than 1%. And it was for a host of reasons. People didn't know about this policy. Even if they knew about it, they didn't know how to access the government mechanisms. And then there were challenges of administrative and political will. So the first point was to kind of understand how many people were affected by the policy. And if you added up the parents, the teachers, and kind of the civil society that was working around this policy, estimate was about 25 million people. Now you have a policy that affects broadly 25 million people with a direct impact on 2 million children from disadvantaged backgrounds. And it was very clear that you needed to mobilize the other 23 million to make this policy work. There was no way the rights could reach disadvantaged children, especially in the age group of 3 to 6, if you didn't figure out a way to mobilize the other 23 million people. And so the obvious choice was, amongst all the 23 million people, who cares most about the 2 million children? So it was going to be the parents of the children. And a lot of our passion comes from my personal experience during the Teach For fellowship, but ultimately, like Wendy said, one of the core principles of collective leadership is how do you give work and the mission back to the people who are most affected by it. And just in terms of pure numbers as well, it was incumbent that we look at parents as the advocates and activists for this particular policy implementation. Um, so the way we went about it was to first earn our legitimacy. So one, like we had to kind of show that it is possible. So a lot of first pilot work was to demonstrate that we can do it. And so we did a lot of feet on street campaigning, understood kind of what is the most effective way to get the information across to families. And the second step was once we had enough successes within the community, it was then about kind of convincing parents and mothers who were successful in going through the step from not knowing about the policy to actually having their child in school and having them successfully thriving in school, become advocates for it. So the second year then was a move to having community champions or mothers coming in from kind of the beneficiary group become advocates. And so one of our big learnings has been that to make that transition, like I said, step one is so you need to have enough bright spots and success stories. And second, like you need to provide a platform for them to come and engage in the problem. Because it's easier to engage because you've gone through your own personal experience. The third, I guess, is we've learned that you need to provide the coaching and kind of tools for them to be successful. So the way we do that is we provide whatever we've kind of codified as what works. We try and make it as easy as possible for somebody with, say, limited access to education and limited access to power, kind of achieve the same objectives. So whether it's technology tools or whether it's a network of people they could rely on, constant engagement. So these are, speak to the third thing that you said. How do you create a space where people come in and know they belong? And also they know that if they're not kind of succeeding at the objectives which they set out to, there's a support group I can fall back on to get more resources or at least get more psychological support. Yeah.
And can you share, I saw these numbers yesterday, but share where you are in this process and what some of that looks like.
Yeah. I mean, I tell my team that, we need to tell that we are ultimately playing the role of an enlightened broker. So we are brokering the system, but in many ways, like it's our community champions and it's our partners who are actually making the work happen. So we've, in the last 5 years, been lucky enough to kind of replicate this work in 10 states in India. So 11 states out of 29 are implementing this policy. So we almost kind of saturated the states that have moved some degree. So our next step is kind of getting the other 18 states in the map. So we've admitted about 30,000 children through the network of volunteers and champions in the last year. And this year we're looking at 300,000. Potentially 1 million next year.
That's so incredible. I want to ask Tarun you one more question, because Tarun is one of just a growing number of incredible Teach for India alums who are exerting leadership in many different communities around India, but you live in Delhi, yes? And even just in Delhi, there are so many folks, whether they're, working to retrain school principals or retrain other teachers or have different posts within the government or have launched one social enterprise or another or leading schools. I mean, there's so many people, probably hundreds of them by now, who are kind of exerting leadership across that kind of ecosystem around children. And I guess I just wonder what your experience is around both the possibilities, the challenges around this question of space. Like, how do we, clearly we're growing the leadership around the ecosystem, but how do we create the space? Like, are you all having luck in doing that?
So I have one kind of growing, I think, emerging insight, I would say. So all of us definitely come to the fellowship with a sense of a social commitment to translate some of the passion we feel about how equity should look like in education and in general society around us. So it is a self-selection of a lot of us who care about kind of finding meaning and making a social contribution with our careers. So I come from the first cohort in Teach for India. So at that point of time, we didn't know whether Teach for India was a good organization to kind of risk our careers with. But we relied on kind of Teach for America and Teach for All's kind of backing. Now I think there's a lot more confidence in what the platform stands for, what we as a group of networked individuals stands for. So I think it's a lot more safer for young people to come in and do the Teach for India Fellowship. So I think as kind of people from the first cohort, we take, at least the first few cohorts, we take a lot of ownership to kind of say that, I mean, a lot of what we do would kind of set the path for subsequent fellows to look at and potentially kind of emulate. So one kind of key thing is how do you make it easier for kind of subsequent set of fellows and people in the community to be able to take more risks. So I think that has been kind of one theme which is kind of driven a lot of the initial cohorts, and we speak about it in kind of our cohort level alumni talks or in our alumni discussions. How do we kind of make the path easy? So for example, entry barriers into politics is really hard in India, especially if you don't have, you don't belong to a certain family, if you don't have a certain level of finances, or you don't have a certain degree of fame, right? So those are kind of three correlates to breaking barriers in a field like politics. But because we've been at it since the last 7-8 years, and especially in Delhi, this is a core theme when I was kind of running operations there as well. So we introduced a lot of information to fellows, and now we have one of our alumni who leads the Delhi Commission for Protection of Child Rights. So he was a fellow when I was leading operations. He went on to kind of become a committee member. So he kind of leads this commission where he has kind of the authority, formal authority, to commission anybody in the city state on any child rights issue, right? And so we've come a long way since 2009, where we had no representation in government and policy making, to now where we have a significant 1 to 2% of the alumni who are in different kind of public policy positions in Delhi and elsewhere. So that has come about like through a lot of kind of intentionality and strategy as well, but also the spirit that like let's make it easy so that other subsequent set of people could kind of follow through and kind of take up more influential positions.
Okay. Helpful. Okay, so Kaya, I know this has been a learning journey for you as well, and I'm wondering if you can, and for the folks who just came in, I explained that actually, maybe I'll let you tell the story, like what your experience was like, and as you moved into the chancellorship, how you worked to develop real partnership with the community in which you were working. I can't get over, anyone who knows the US context, and some of the dynamics are very similar in other parts of the world where the politics of education are just very challenging. So it's just very hard to pursue a real bold change agenda and to bring the community along, you know, and what Kaya did, I think, is just such an incredible example of developing those partnerships and actually working with the community and kind of demonstrating the kind of collective leadership approach that we're talking about. So I kind of want to hear more about your journey.
Sure. I'll just give you the sort of quick and dirty. For 40 years, DC Public Schools was kind of descending, spiraling. People were fleeing the city, fleeing the public schools. We saw enrollment drop by about 50,000 kids over the course of 40 years. And literally, it was the choice of last resort for any families. If they could get their kids into something else, they would. And I came into DCPS at a point where the city was had enacted a charter school law where you could open up a bunch of public schools that were not run by the government. Some will say in an effort to sort of give parents more choice. Others will say in an effort to destroy the traditional public school system because it wasn't working, and they felt like the competition would either push the public school system up or send it home packing forever. And in 2007, there was a huge law that shifted in DC where the public school system was placed under mayoral control. So the mayor of the city now selected the school chancellor and was responsible for the operations of the public school system. I came in as the deputy chancellor under Michelle Rhee, who was the chancellor at the time, and we had a real clear mandate to do whatever it took to turn around this failing school system. At the time, DC Public Schools was the lowest performing urban school district in the country as measured by our National Assessment of Educational Progress. And in 2007, we set out with a bold and aggressive agenda to really think about who was putting a high-quality teacher in front of every single kid, putting a high-quality school leader in every single building, and changing the policies to enable that to happen. And we did a lot of really good work. We did groundbreaking work around teacher evaluation so that we were able to understand who our best teachers were, who we needed to develop, and who we needed to move out. We changed our teacher pay system so that we now have the highest paid first-year teachers in the country. We wanted to be a district that attracted talent. We revised our union contract. We created a pay-for-performance system so that our highest-performing teachers could be recognized and rewarded. We fixed systems that were broken. We did lots of things, and we literally had to pull the district apart in order to put it back together again. And so the first 3.5 years was a lot of egg breaking. And I would say a leadership style that was really, I have a vision for where we need to go. The mayor and the chancellor had a very clear vision for where they needed to go, and they were sort of moving forward in that direction. I think the thing that we did not do well at all was engage the community in that vision and help them understand how they fit in. And it was to our detriment, quite frankly. At the end of the first 3.5 years, the city was up in arms. People were angry, even though there was progress happening in schools, because the community was left behind. It didn't appreciate the progress. It didn't care, and it wanted something different. At which point, I landed as chancellor. That was not my plan, but that was how it worked out. And I think I approached it with a bit of a different mindset, in part because of who I am, but also in part because of what I had seen over this first 3.5 years. I think the first thing that I realized was that these are not my schools, right? These are our schools. They weren't mine and the mayor's, they were the community's, right? Schools are community assets. And if you believe that the community owns these schools, then you've got to make decisions with the community. You can't make decisions for the community. I think the other thing that I sort of realized was that the community actually has a ton of assets. They have data that we don't have. They have relationships that we don't have. There's talent there that we don't recognize. In fact, when school systems are broken, we believe that it's the community's fault, right? If you could have, you would have done differently. You know, if the talent was there, we wouldn't be in this situation, when the truth of the matter is there are lots of systemic issues, right, that prevent these communities from being able to create great schools for their students. And so with those two things in mind, I think I didn't have this framework in my head, but I sought to build a diverse coalition, right? If these are not my schools, these are our schools, we're all gonna make these decisions. And I realized that schools couldn't do it by themselves. I was dealing with young people who had expansive healthcare issues and transportation issues and housing instability issues. And so even if I had the best teachers in school, if kids are suffering from all of these issues, right, it doesn't matter that they're getting a great classroom education. We've got to work out their whole situation. And so I was able to partner with the Department of Health to focus on some of my most pressing communities in need, and they could focus their energies on the places where we saw the most need. I was able to partner with nonprofit organizations. I was able to partner with neighborhood organizations. But effectively, I enlisted everybody in this effort, right? Schools can't do it alone. We have to work together to fix schools. Because, again, I believe that there are community assets. We looked at the leadership that was in these communities and we asked them to help us, right? If they were involved in the decision making, then they could go back to their colleagues in the neighborhood and explain why we were making these decisions, as opposed to some lady who was sitting in an office downtown, right? And so we engaged parents and we engaged community leaders and we engaged neighborhood commissioners to help us make big changes. When we had to close schools, we gave all of the data to the community, and we asked them to bring their data with with them, and we made joint decisions together about which schools to close and which schools to stay open. It was a terrible thing. Nobody wants to close schools, but we needed to realign our resources, and we made those decisions with the community. What I find is if you give people the tools to make change, they know what change to make. We just don't trust our communities. And so I think from the parents' example in Delhi to what we experienced in DC, all parents want great things for their kids. All parents can make good decisions. They just haven't been given the tools, and they haven't been given the opportunity. And what I realized was just because I felt this way about communities and parents, or just because I felt this way about sort of shared leadership, that didn't guarantee that the person who came after me, or even the people who were working for me, would operate in that way. And so I had to think about how you build systems so that people can do this work whether they believe this or not, right? And this is the sort of creating the space piece. So for example, we created a parent cabinet and a student cabinet and a teacher cabinet, right? And I met with these folks. You applied for the position so that we made sure that we had a diverse set of people from every neighborhood, for teachers from every grade level, from all different kinds of schools. And before we rolled out any new initiative, we took it to the teacher cabinet, the parent cabinet, the student cabinet, and said, this is what we're thinking. Here's the problem that we're trying to solve. Here's all the backup data. This is our best thinking. What do you think we should do about this? And lots of times the parents or the teachers or the students would give us completely different insights than what we were thinking. And what started to happen was the expectation that before we did anything big at DC Public Schools, we had these sets of people that we had to engage. Further, I asked each of my department heads to form their own parent cabinet. So before it even comes to the leadership table, you should have vetted this idea with parents or with teachers or with students. And so those kinds of systems enabled us to sort of institutionalize this level of engagement. Technology was a huge enabler. So for example, when we were closing schools, we asked people to not only tell us what they wanted to say in forums where we met with people, we put up an online portal. And so even if you couldn't come to the meetings, you could make suggestions, and we were very diligent about taking people's suggestions, and if they were incorporated in a final proposal, great, you saw it, and if it wasn't, we put on the website, these are other things that we heard, and here's why we couldn't do them. Sometimes we just didn't have money, or this would take more time, or whatever, but people feeling like you heard them because you at least acknowledged their suggestion, even if you couldn't do it, made a world of difference. And so we were able to do a lot of different things that sort of systematize this way of working. And I think there's one downside, which is this kind of decision-making or leadership. I call it leadership from the side, right? Or leadership in partnership. So not leader out front, charging forward, but leader amongst a set of people who can impact the change. It takes longer. Leadership from the front is you just say what you're going to do and you do it. But I'd watched us do that for 3.5 years, and literally people were willing to upend the city. And when we started to engage folks and include them in the decision-making and create these spaces for this decision-making to happen, it takes longer because not everybody is ready to engage right now. You have to build relationships with people and that kind of thing. But it will also stick, right? And so, even after I've left the position, those systems, those entities, the parent cabinet and teacher cabinet, student cabinet are still in place. The expectations that parents have to make decisions about their schools is high. So we just had a huge problem happen in DC. And it's terrible, it's terrible, it's terrible. But I think the silver lining of this terrible situation is parents saying, nope, this is our decision to make. This is not politicians' decision to make. This is not the chancellor's decision to make. This is our decision to make, and this is what we want. And I think when parents feel that level of ownership, when the community feels that level of ownership, when leaders are responsive to that level of ownership, I think you get the kind of transformation that we're looking for.
Perfect. Beautiful. Well, I'm curious what you all think And so I wonder if we can, I can't tell if this clock is right, but do we have like 15 minutes? Okay, let's just take a couple minutes with you all talking turn to your neighbor. Just to consider the questions of, first of all, what do you think about this notion that we need to make an intentional effort to cultivate collective leadership in order to get where we're trying to go for children? And secondly, what do you think it would take to actually see that happening in the communities that you're most familiar with? Let's just talk among yourselves for a bit, and then we'll kind of surface some of the thoughts and questions and kind of go from there.
By the way, you still have time. You still have 90 minutes. That's your time.
Okay, perfect.
So until this time finish, you
Good,
have all
good,
the-
good, good.
Yeah. And I will be having the mic if someone needs
Okay,
to.
perfect.
Some kind of weird lecture like so now they should letting people to do discussions between them.
So you all, I'm going to pull this back together.
Can you have our mic?
So can we, I'd love to surface some of what you all are talking about into the group, although I know it's hard to stop these conversations. So can we hear, I'm curious what thoughts, questions are emerging from you all's discussions. So let's kind of pass the mic around to some of you to surface the things most on your mind as it relates to this.
Good morning. Our discussion was based around Africa, and we were very much saying that it's contextually very different in respect of how to set up that type of transformational change. because of the structure of the community. And to have those separate communities or those cabinets is actually quite difficult because of the way that the different sort of areas are led and established. And that's really where our conversation went. Would you like to add anything?
Yeah, and we were also wondering the mechanism that you put in place to bring the students on board, and also the teachers. One would have assumed that the decision coming from you would have already had input from the teachers, but I didn't. So how did you organize the teachers and the students to make input? We wanted to.
Sure. I think that, first of all, I think everything is contextual. At Teach for All, we talk about things being globally informed, so we want to learn from examples from all over the world, but it has to be locally rooted. And so whatever your leadership systems are or however your community is organized, you've got to come up with solutions that fit that context. Context matters. For us, the assumption that teachers were engaged in decision making has been sort of codified in the teachers union, right? And so if you looked at prior decision making, having a teachers union president at the table to sort of negotiate with you around big decisions was the way decisions got made. But we had 4,000 teachers in Washington, D.C., and only, a small portion of them actively participated in the union. And what we learned as we went out and talked to teachers directly was that many of them had different opinions than what their union president thought. So continuing to rely on sort of one teacher voice didn't make sense to us. So we invited teachers to apply for the cabinet, and we created, enough spots so that you could have representation from every neighborhood in the city. We're divided into 8 different wards in Washington, D.C., so we made sure that there were teachers from every ward, that there were teachers from pre-K, elementary, middle, high school, alternative schools. We made sure that we had a diversity of race as much as we possibly could, and we also tried to make sure that it wasn't always the usual suspects, the teachers that you always see, who have another platform to weigh in. And we tried to elevate teacher voice in that way. Same thing with parents and students. We invited people to apply, and then we tried to put together a mosaic of people that was representative of all of our stakeholders and constituents.
I do really want to reinforce the idea that it's so contextual, right? And I think about the work that I was describing that Nadine Paul DeRolli has been doing in communities in Haiti, where she's literally going in and engaging, like asking the folks in the communities, who do you most trust in this community? And engaging those people in figuring out, so what is our vision for students? And then holding the spaces to say, what is it going to take? Like, what's the next thing we need to do in order to move towards this vision? So, what her approach isn't even working through the traditional, quote, system in order to engage the folks in order to develop collective leadership, basically. Let's go around, let's surface a number of thoughts and then we'll sort of react. Other, yes.
Thank you. So my name's Robin. And I just want to share a little bit and ask a question of you. Our organization works in South Africa, and we basically have developed a program that is now been implemented in 730 schools around the country, and we expect to be in another 400 by the end of the year, where we equip principals and communities to site the school at the center of community. And we have a very strong focus on moving from patriarchy to partnership. South Africa's education system is really, really difficult contextually because schools are not owned by the community. Schools were a site of political, activism and a site of oppression in many instances. And I think in India, that's why we see so many similarities, is because of that politicization of education. But without fail, what we have found in every single school where these partnerships have been successful is that it's the moment that the community owns that school. that the change happens. And the principals repeatedly tell us, we ask them, what is the moment that this changed for you? And it is when the parents actually become actively involved. So I think it can be done. We've seen that it works, that our model works in urban, peri-urban, rural, semi-rural areas. It works in Priska, which is the tiniest little village in the middle of a desert in the Northern Cape, and it works in Gauteng, which is a really large urban centre. And it's all about relationship, and it's all about respect, and it is all around leadership through partnership. So my question is, how do we seek out the models that work well, and how do we amplify that?
Yeah, I just have a question. So with parents, teachers, and all other stakeholders, how do you deal with the difference in mindsets, and which is very huge comparatively if that scale is taken? Like they come from so many diverse backgrounds and communities representing them. So they will definitely have a strong mindset from their side. So how do you arrive at decisions and taking things forward while still considering all of this or bringing them on to one table? So I think that's a everyday challenge which you might be facing. So I just wanted to know how you deal with those things.
Yes, this is one of the biggest questions that arises. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a very inspiring session. I'm from Japan, and I keep hearing this massive impact that alums are making from your organization, and I'm wondering if there's any way to sort of institutionalize this. I know you have a very structured teacher training for Teach for All, but the way your alums are becoming such a change makers in every aspect of our, I wonder if we can duplicate that in our country, for example. Like, how can we train our adults to become like them? Thank you.
Perfect. Any questions over here or thoughts, Khadija?
Thank you. Hi, I'm Khadija from Pakistan. I have a question for Tarun. Tarun, one thing that you were talking about when you were speaking about the work of the Intersection organization was how critical it is to establish success stories, right, before you could go to the next level of this work, of advocating for this law to be implemented well across India. And so my question to you is how much work does that take so you can convince, in this first round, if you convince parents to be able to send their kids to school because it's their right, then how much work does it take to ensure that those kids actually do well in those schools? Because I think one thing that it comes to mind is it's not just about working with the parents, but also about working with the schools at the same time, so it kind of falls together. Thanks.
Perfect. Any other big thoughts, questions? So I'll just ask one more, and then we can just...
Hello. Hello from Ukraine, and it happened that we were sitting together, and we are from one country. So it's very up-to-date problem in Ukraine also, how to make a contact between parents and school, teachers and students. So we also had such a problem to have that common and the same idea of how to develop our educational system. And now in Ukraine we have a great educational reform, and we face that problem how to involve parents in the process of reforming our educational environment also. And the thing is, we are worried about, we do not know how to make them active, because they know only how to work, try to make money, and they bring their children to school, and they think that the school can do everything for them, and they do not want to make any decision, because maybe they sorry. Oh yeah, so they pay money for education. They give us money and they say, okay, you do everything. So the thing is that we also do not know how to make it perfect, and we are looking for the tools. And thank you very much for inspiring us to do this and to find the solution in our own community, because we know that we have to find something for our country, because it's different in the world, in different countries. Thank you.
Perfect. Do you all want to just react to any of the above?
So I'll take a couple. So one is, like, I see a pattern for kind of systemizing this work, and how do we kind of codify the principles and then kind of localize it to a context. So I want to point out to one, Teach for All's own resources on collective leadership. And there's also kind of pretty prominent work done by FSG on collective impact. So if you search for FSG and collective impact, they have kind of 8 principles which drive collective impact. This is from a host of organizations, apart from Teach for All as well, where they've seen how collective leadership and collective impact kind of play out in different problem contexts. So that's one kind of resource which is very helpful to kind of take as a framework which has been kind of studied in multiple contexts and applied to whether it's Ukraine or South Africa, or India or Pakistan. So that might be a good tool and resource to start with. That's one reaction I had. To Khadija's question, so one of the things we've learned is to kind of find success in every stage of the way and amplify it. So for example, one of the early things we discovered was how do we kind of amplify information within communities? And the early insight we got was word of mouth was the most effective kind of translator or kind of a spreader of information. And so what we would do is every time a community member kind of received a call, all she had to do was request the parent on the call to spread the information to 10 other parents, right? And it required kind of 6 months of doing that cycle, where then the word of mouth became actually the biggest kind of contributor to kind of calls on our helpline. So that's one, like how do you break down every step of your process and kind of articulate what success is and kind of really invite people to kind of partake in that success. And we're very surprised by how much kind of generosity and kind of ability to pay it forward already exists. It's about kind of believing that it exists and kind of creating processes for it. So don't wait for kind of the eventual success, which is in our scheme of work, the eventual success is, yes, filing an application is one success point, getting an admission is second success point, and retention is the third success point. But you can break that down into kind of smaller steps of success as well. To the second point about how do you ensure momentum so that people feel a continuous sense of success, what we've tried to do is kind of take on this idea of positive deviance. Whatever problem you're trying to solve, like there are already people who've deviated from the norm, right, and have achieved success. You call them bright spots or positive deviance. There's a lot you can learn about what they've cracked, right? So our approach has always been like, are there schools that have already with their existing resources created inclusive environments? So we kind of dive deep and say, like, can we publish a kind of assimilated study of schools across the board on how they've created inclusive environments? Now, how do we take that and then kind of amplify it to many more schools and many more teachers? So that's been one approach. And the second is obviously using data, which is what the collective impact principle also says. How do you use data constantly to iterate and adapt? So we track kind of retention percentages of every child that we admit to kind of foresee what could be potentially the dropout rates in the future. We build a prediction model as well. So there, I think one of the learnings has been that the system doesn't react if there is not ripeness for change. So we've been saying that there is a potential for dropout, but it's not reflecting in numbers right now. Kids are in grade 3 and the retention rates are 91, 92%. So everybody in the system is saying, like, why do you care so much about dropout when it's not manifesting? But we kind of know that when kids graduate to grade 3 and 4 or in secondary, the potential for dropout is higher. So in many ways, you have to create the ripeness for change as well, or wait till kind of some of the kind of events in the system manifest in real data. But you have to have kind of your framework in place to react when those events eventually happen.
Perfect. And I know we only have a minute or so, but Kaya.
I'll try to hit the other two, how to bring parents along and how to replicate the leadership of Teach for All alums. So that's the quick and easy one. I think what Teach for All brings to how we train our leaders is values-driven leadership, right? We operate against a set of values and against a vision or a belief of what can happen for young people. And I think the expectation is set that we will do anything, whatever it takes, to realize that vision as long as we are leading according to our values. And so I think we do have to think differently about how we train our leaders, because we are really focused on, broadly, we're focused on training leaders to sort of lead from the front. And I think we've got to get explicit about teaching people how to lead through values and with other people. The how to bring parents along part. So I think the first thing that we have to do is recognize what is important to parents. We lead with what's important to us. We have this big countrywide reform that we want you to be interested in. Parents are not interested in the countrywide reform. They're interested in what's happening for their kid. So how do you help parents help their kid first? And if parents feel like they are, we've done home visits and we train our teachers, because the teachers are the first line of interaction with parents. And so if teachers are building ways for parents to get into the classroom and to help their own kid, then parents can think a little differently about, okay, how do I help my school, or how do I help my district, or how do I help my country? The other thing is we have to speak parents' language. So we keep talking about your kids are going to get higher standardized test scores. That doesn't matter to parents, right? When I talk to parents, they want to know, is their kid going to get a job, right? Is their kid going to be able, even if they want their kid to go to college, is so they can get a good job and they can be economically secure. So let's start talking in the language that parents care about. We started talking about how the changes that we were making would better prepare our young people for the careers that were coming online. We invited parents into that conversation, and since that was what they wanted to talk about, they were willing to engage. But far too often, we couch our relations with parents in terms of what's important to us, not what's important to them. I think if we flip that dynamic, we can bring parents along. It's not easy, and different people are at different places. This is why I said doing this work this way takes longer. But you got to build the relationships. Even if people don't get it the first time, you keep going back at it the second time, the third time, the fourth time, whatever. And you share success. When you get a win, you talk about how the parent input that you got actually is part of the reason why you got this win. And when parents start to see themselves in some of the successes, more will come, and they want to learn, they want to be involved. So I think it's possible.
Perfect. And I'll just close by also addressing a couple of these that I heard. I mean, one of the biggest questions I personally hear is the one that you raised around, what happens when the folks in your community don't share your values. And I won't pretend to know the answer to this, but I think the answer is not trying to ignore that and sweep it under the table. And I actually think that's sometimes our instinct. It's like, we better not go there and try to have this collective discussion. The problem is we're never going to get where we're trying to go if we just leave that unaddressed. So that's one thought. Another is just, I guess we've found that, if we take an assets-based approach and really start from the vantage point of, why do you love your girls? Why do you love your kids? Like, what do you hope for them? Like, we start with the questions that will bring out maybe elements that create common ground, then there's maybe a path. And I guess this, to me, just brings us back to this notion of space. Like, if we can actually pull ourselves up from all of our daily pursuits to create the space to actually build relationships and have these discussions, I think will surface where the common ground is and what we can work from to move forward. And I think that's maybe one of the most crucial elements if we're really going to ultimately develop the collective leadership we need. And the last thing I'll say also to the Teach for All question is that I think the closer you get to these organizations within countries, you realize it's not just about their leadership. That's really one of the reasons we kind of re-articulated our core purpose, developing collective leadership, because when you get close to it, you realize it's about the leadership of the students in their classrooms and the other teachers in their schools and the others in their communities. And I just think that these folks can be kind of a helpful catalytic force. So hopefully we'll grow Teach for Japan and Teach for Ukraine and many of the other, and in your countries, if you are interested in supporting the development of this approach, just let us know. So thank you all again for prioritizing this session, which I think, you know, I don't know. I don't know that there's a path to getting the place that brings us all to this conference and extravaganza, or whatever we're calling it, other than through developing collective leadership. So I hope this becomes just a bigger and bigger part of the discussion. Thanks, you all.
You want to share Alex or Kaya's